All right. So, as introduced to you in the last session on planning, planning includes looking ahead to all aspects of a project, including scope, schedule, budget, quality, risk, and finally putting it all together and figuring out how to make it work, including your approach to complexity and change. In topic A, planning projects, you learned how project teams can plan for successful outcomes using PMI's best practices. And as a reminder, most of the content in this section refers to the process domain in the exam content outline, or what you're hearing referred to as the ECO, or the way of working side of the talent triangle. But we'll explore relevant leadership power skills and business environment factors as well tonight. These are the learning objectives for this topic on planning. Our focus in this particular session is described in that second bullet there. Provide an overview of scope planning in both predictive and adaptive projects. So scope planning is our focus tonight, particularly in both predictive and those adaptive projects. So in the last session, as I mentioned, y'all gained an understanding of how project planning happens across project life cycles. Given that information, we're now ready to get into the business of planning. And typically, we start with scope. The Project Management Institute identifies conflicting scope changes as the primary reason for project failure. In business, project scope plays a critical role in project management. When it lacks clear definition, it can result in significant schedule and budget difficulties. The project scope delineates what is included and excluded from a project. However, defining project scope remains challenging for many teams as it encompasses the project's purpose, objectives, and the necessary steps to achieve them. Essentially, scope establishes the project's boundaries. The project manager will continually be referring to the scope statement to ensure the project achieves the scope. Before we get into all the nuances of scope, we need to be clear about what we mean by scope. Project scope, by definition, is the sum of the products, services, and results to be provided as a project. Project scope is identified in the initiating agreements or contract statements, or what is known as the statements of work. Many of you might be familiar with that if you've dealt with contracts here at AT&T. Usually when we engage with the vendor, right, we're going to lay out what the statement of work is, what we want that vendor to actually bring to us, right, to deliver to us in exchange for the money that we're going to pay them, okay? Product scope, on the other hand, refers to the features and functions that characterize a product, service, or result. Think of this as a description of the output of the work. You know, is that to produce a database? Is it to deliver a particular type of service? And what are the parameters around what that service should be? The product scope may be included in the project scope, but it is defined separately. The main thing to understand is that project scope is a much larger concept. In other words, it takes into consideration more than just the product that is actually being delivered. We also need to understand that there are projects that have a fixed scope, while others will have a flexible scope. When scope is fixed, we can build a product or run a project using a detailed, plan-based approach. However, if the scope is flexible for any reason, whether that's because of changing circumstances, uncertainty, complexity, innovation, or a customer-driven environment, because, you know, customers often change their minds, then a detailed plan-based approach won't work. We need to be adaptive. So let's look at these concepts in the context of a case study for the Shop Lifestyle Center project. So the project scope of the Shop Lifestyle Center is to complete a construction project and engage a sales and marketing project to fill it with tenants over time. So we have two things that are part of our project scope. The product scope is the completed revitalization of OC's town with bespoke or customized spaces for commercial and community tenants. Okay. Our fixed scope, the scope of the construction project is fixed, right? It's based on finalized blueprints and building compliance requirements with little room for change, and it has a specific timeline. So in this instance, the construction project is considered fixed. The scope of the sales and marketing project, however, has some flexibility to it. It depends on the timely completion of that construction project, market forces, and the customer's desired design. The team will derive as much value as possible, as early as possible, by working iteratively and incrementally. So what we can expect here, because of the customer's needs, right? They don't understand fully how they want that portion of the project to happen. So, we're going to try to figure out what we can deliver to them to deliver value as early as possible. But over time, they're going to figure out what it is that they want, and then we'll be delivering that accordingly. A fixed scope is increasingly uncommon because planning rarely happens all at once and at the beginning of the project. That's pretty much why we have the concepts of Agile today, right? The concept of rolling wave planning enables a team to begin working even if terms and conditions are uncertain and subject to change. Rolling wave planning is a commonly used technique to leverage flexibility in planning the scope. It's a form of progressive elaboration applied to work packages, planning packages, and release planning, and it is seen in adaptive or predictive approaches. More succinctly, it's an iterative planning technique that any project team can use regardless of life cycle. A couple of benefits of rolling wave planning include being able to start work without a full picture of all the details and the ability to focus the team on the work packages, planning packages, or release planning for the present view, while delaying detailed planning of work until closer to the time that work is required. Rolling wave planning supports the lean concept. I'm not sure if y'all have heard about this yet, but if you haven't, you will. But it supports the lean concept of decide as late as possible. So let's take a little bit closer look at MVPs and MBIs by watching a short video. Both terms describe ways of organizing the value of work in an incremental fashion. So here's my video. I don't know if y'all be able to hear it. I hope so, but I'll stop it for a moment and ask you. Can you hear anything?
Not yet.
Not yet.
We see it, but we can't hear it.
Yeah, just wonder. I don't know how to get that volume to play. Do y'all? Anybody? I mean, I can hit it. I can hear it on my side. Wait a minute. There's a setting here somewhere, and folks, I just don't know how to. I don't know how to get it to do that for you. Nobody's ever done that before, right? Video.
Did you check your computer setting to make sure the sound is up?
Yeah, I know there's a way to do that
We
sound.
could hear it. We could hear it a little bit, but it was low. So that's what I was thinking. Maybe it might be a volume thing.
I think it's a way if you actually go hover at the top, it should be an option where you could do like presenting mode sound.
Yeah. That. See, I would think that it would be here, and now I've got an echo.
Somebody's got their phone in there.
Let me stop sharing. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you might want to mute everybody.
Yeah, I think it was me. Um, I'm just testing right now. I still hear this echo. Folks,
When you're using the share button, if you hover over it, does it include share with audio?
Yeah, in the help it says if you're playing a video during a presentation, if you select share, should be an option to turn on include computer sound at the top.
Yeah, that's it.
right here. I'm getting an. I'm gonna close it and I'm gonna open this back up. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. Okay.
No worries.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
I think it's when you click share, it says include sound on there. I don't know if you can see it though.
Yeah, it may also be I don't know what version of Teams is being used, the new one or the old one.
Good point. I get a black or white depending on which team's update of the day happens. So anyway.
All right. And I do not hear a echo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. I'm sorry. So where do I go? Or what do I do?
At the top, when you click share, when you're going to share, there's a button that says include sound. I don't know if you see that. We were discussing, we didn't know which version you had.
Got it. I see it. So I'll show you. I'm going to bring over, right? So I'm clicking on include sound, but it's not letting me do it. If I click on share screen. So I'm sharing now. But yeah, it wouldn't let me. Y'all can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead and
But
share. Yeah, the funny thing is that we can see it when you're not sharing. It gives you that option. But when you share, it does give you that option. So I would unshare and try it again. Hit
okay.
that share
I'll stop.
button and then you
Yeah.
you hit share and
Uh-huh.
you should see something that says share content and include sound button up at the top. See that?
Share content includes sound, but it's not. Couldn't share sound. Go to device settings and select 2HP. I'm sorry. This is so sad. I'm technically incompetent. Here, 1 second. So I need to change over to HP 27FW for the 2 device audio settings. All right. One moment.
Can you show us your audio settings?
Uh-huh. Yeah, so it says go to device audio settings and select 2HP, which is this right here. And that's what I have. All right, here's what we're going to do. 1 second. I think I know how to remedy this situation for a moment. So I'm almost there. Bear with me. So Let me bring the presentation back over here to this page. I'm going to share on this screen right here. And I'm going to, I won't stop sharing. I'm going to share. If this doesn't work, we'll move on. But I think it's just because of where the speakers are. No, it's not.
Are you using the computer speakers?
Yeah. Yeah. See it is. Yeah, so it's the computer speakers, but for some reason it just isn't. There's something not quite right here, because I've got the right one selected.
Did you want
I
to
have the right.
share the link in the chat, and maybe we could
Yeah,
all watch it?
yeah, I think that might be the best thing to do if it has a link here that we can use. So it's a good idea. I'm going to reshare my content again though, and then we're going to move on. So 1 second. I apologize for that. It's just a technical glitch that happened. Okay. Mm, There's not one here. There's not one here. I tell you what I'll do is I will, there's not a link that I can give you for this because it doesn't link out. It's kind of probably proprietary content for the PMI. I'll try to find out if there's a way for us to get this to you. The net of it is, so I've listened through the video a couple of times, is there's two concepts. There's an MVP or an MVI, okay? And the MVP it stands for minimal viable product, right? And it's producing an output, right, that is just enough work to get an idea, of what we want to put out there, So it's just kind of like a very small piece of a project, right? So that we can kind of do some more discovery. Maybe we really don't know for sure what the customer wants, right? But we have an idea, at least some starting ideas. So what I want to do is I want to put together some features, go ahead and put that out there for the customer to use, right? And maybe to sell a little bit. And then I'm going to start learning, based off what that customer's response is to that MVP. I'll give you an example for in my own work. So this credit transformation project that I mentioned, it could be rather big, the things that we want to accomplish in that particular initiative, because not only do we have, the end customer and our sellers to think about, but our credit team also would like to get some things done with this particular project as well while we're about it, right? But before we delve into that, what we want to do is just kind of put a piece of that functionality out there, see how they respond to it or whatever, and then we can go ahead and start adding some additional features and so forth into that project. So because it's again another iterative way to go about getting our product or service out there. The NBI, minimum business or minimal business increment, is what NBI stands for, right? We'll typically use that to expand or enhance a product, an existing product, right? So what we're again trying to do here is similar concepts, right? But we're this time in the MBI, we're actually expanding or enhancing on an existing product, right? Not on a prospective opportunity or a new product as we would with an MVP. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. But I will still see what I can do to get y'all the video. I thought it was an interesting video. Okay, and again, I apologize for the technical glitch there. I'll see what I can do to get that improved for the next opportunity. All right. So the full presentation should be back up on the screen here. So a product roadmap is a high-level visual summary of the product or products of the project that includes your goals, your milestones, and your potential deliverables. Even though product roadmaps originated in agile approaches, they are helpful in all development approaches, and they provide a way to show the potential delivery time frame of various features and functions. This is also defined as a chronological depiction of the project work. Again, it can be used in all development approaches and is, in fact, highly recommended for showing understanding and progress. So often, if you were communicating with executives and so forth, you'd be sharing what your product roadmap is with them when you're talking about your project. Characteristics of a product roadmap are listed here. A product roadmap envisions and it plans for the big picture. It displays your product strategy and direction and the value that you're going to be delivering. It leads with an overarching vision of the product or service. What value are we looking to deliver here with this project? It uses progressive elaboration, as we were talking about in the rolling conversation we had, over time and with information and work inputs, to refine the vision. And additionally, it uses themes or goals to provide structure and associations. And lastly, it provides short-term and long-term visualization. So if you haven't used a roadmap in some of your projects, when you get to bigger projects, you'll probably see the need to use them because there's a lot of information that you're going to want to be able to convey, and you'll want to make that easy to digest. As the previous slide observes, the roadmap provides a high-level timeline that depicts, among other things, milestones. A milestone is a specific point within a project life cycle used as a measure in the progress toward the goal. It marks a specific point along a project timeline. The point may signal anchors such as a project start and end date, a need for external review, or input and budget checks. It is represented as a task of zero duration, and it is displayed as an important achievement in the project. Additional or emphasizing characteristics are that they mark big events, such as reviews, due dates, payments, or decision points. They prompt for reporting requirements or sponsor customer approval or inspections. And they're created by the project manager, the customer, or both. The milestone list identifies all the milestones, and it lists those that are mandatory as well, whether required by a contract or whether they're optional. Okay. Let's shift now to compare approaches to planning scope in predictive and adaptive projects. But before we do that, it's important to stress that in all project teams, team members should be a part of clarifying and prioritizing the requirements, splitting requirements into tasks, and estimating the effort. This is essential to ensure the commitment of the entire team at the beginning of the project. The team members also know the work best, so therefore they can give the most accurate estimates. Steps in the predictive scope planning process typically center on the roles of the project manager facilitating the collect requirements process, documenting those requirements that include a scope statement and a work breakdown structure, and developing the schedule, budget, resource, and quality plans to deliver the requirements. Steps in the adaptive scope planning process, however, they center around the product owner who creates and refines the release backlog for the iteration planning meeting and explaining each prioritized user story in detail to the team. Key tasks that the team engages in include estimating effort, placing user stories into the release backlog to support identified features and functions, and using a story map to sequence and prioritize user stories in the release backlog. Okay. So that kind of covers some of those roles, right, that are important in this process. Okay, so let's get started. with
Would you
requirements.
mind, I'm sorry, would you mind clicking
Uh-huh.
on the blue box in the lower left? I think that shows us some definitions of the terms.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Let me give you
Perfect.
that for a moment.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, in fact, I wanted to actually read those. So I'm glad you asked me to call back on that one, right? So these are some of the key definitions that you do want to be familiar with, right? So collect requirements process, that's the process in which the requirements documentation is developed, and it does precede the defined scope process, right? Okay. Requirements documentation, that's a description of how individual requirements meet the business need for the project. And then you have your user stories, which is often used in, agile or adaptive, processes. It's an informal, general explanation of a product, service, or software feature written from the perspective of the user, and its purpose is to articulate how the feature will provide value to that customer. I often use, the user story format, as a customer, I want to see this, as a seller, I want to see this, right? Okay. Right. So as we get ready to dive into the scope planning and the role of requirements, let's take a little bit of a pre-quiz. So I've got 3 questions up here. So I'm going to read the first question, then the second and the third, and you can tell me what the answer is. Yes, sort of, or maybe. Okay. So do predictive projects start with requirements?
Yes. Usually they start with a scope, right? They may I would say maybe.
Anybody else? Predictive projects. And think back to that shop case study, right? There were two pieces of the scope, right? So there were multiple projects. There was at least 2 projects within that scope, right? And one of those projects was the construction, and it was considered predictive. Do you think it starts with requirements?
I think so that you know what your end goal looks like.
Yes. If you remember, the shop study said they were very definitive about what they wanted, right? So that was a predictive, so it started with requirements. So yes, in predictive projects, requirements are elicited and set at the beginning of the project. Okay? Question number 2, do adaptive projects start with requirements? Adaptive. We've narrowed down the number of answers here. Okay, I'll go ahead and give you the answer. It's sort of. So, okay, user stories are a different way of thinking about the requirements process for adaptive projects, okay? So, yes, and, we use the term user stories when we think about requirements for the adaptive projects or the flexible projects, right? And then that leaves our last answer. So do hybrid projects start with requirements? Well, if they're hybrid, yeah, maybe, right? Hybrid projects, they may elicit and refine requirements, or they may compose user stories. Okay. All right, very good. So let's talk a little bit more about requirements. So as you may have already heard, projects support strategy execution and the advancement of business objectives, right? They deliver value. In addition to focusing on meeting scope and quality expectations, project delivery also focuses on meeting requirements to produce the expected deliverables that will drive the intended outcomes. The definition of a requirement is one single measurable statement of a condition or capability. It tells how a product, service, or result satisfies a business need. Project managers rely on requirements to plan the scope of the project, right? So your requirements will inform your scope, okay? The guidelines of requirements include starting at a high level and then drilling down to the details. So envision the process like that of a funnel shape. You start very broad, and then you narrow the focus. It also includes driving for clarity, stating how the requirements will be measurable and testable, traceable, complete, consistent, and acceptable to the key stakeholders. Once the project manager has conceptualized the requirements, the next step is to document them. Documentation of the requirements in any organizational governance deliverables will differ depending on the development approach that the project employs. The project manager will tailor the format and complexity of the requirements documentation to the project, keeping in mind that some organizations may require an elaborate or formal statement, while others may not. And finally, the project manager will use the requirements traceability matrix, a tool often used by business analysts to ensure that all requirements that are to be delivered are completed. The detail contained in the matrix is dependent on the project approach and the criticality of individual requirements. Characteristics of well-documented requirements are clarity, conciseness, degree to which the requirement can be verified, consistency, completeness, and as we've mentioned here, traceability as well. When I started with AT&T and Tech Dev or IT, I was a quality manager, and we tested all of the functionality that was, going into the billing system, right? So we had the releases and so forth, and we'd get, quite a number of new functionality that was going in there. But, so a very broad statement of what the requirement was, right? But then there's, it starts getting broken down as it's got to be blue and this, that, and, you start a lot of things. So if you didn't have the traceability matrix, you could wonder, well, where did this particular requirement come from, right? So your traceability matrix is really important. If you get down the road and you're talking about, well, why are we delivering, this particular, requirement or whatever? Well, it's part of this. We've got to have it in order to deliver this, right? So the requirements traceability matrix is incredibly important as you're developing your requirements. So a requirement, well, bear with me for a second. Did we? Okay, good. Sorry. A requirements management plan is a component of the overall project or program management plan that describes how requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed. This component of the project management plan helps you to determine how requirements, the how, right? How requirements will be captured, verified, traced, and ultimately delivered to the customer. It also addresses how the requirements traceability matrix, which helps teams ensure that all requirements are met, will be organized. So just always remember, if it hasn't been stressed to you enough yet already, it probably will be as you continue on. The overall project management plan just isn't, go into Microsoft Project and you got a bunch of tasks and milestones, right? The overall project management plan includes different components, right? Planning for scope, planning for quality, planning, there's just, 10 or 12 different things in the project management planning cycle, right, that you've got to think about. And so they're little booklets, basically, or little, subsections of your overall project management plan. Well, the requirements management plan is part of your overall project management plan, okay? It's very important. Okay. Before we move on, let's look a little closer at the different types of requirements. Project requirements are those that the project manager or team have identified from either the business case, contract, the statement of work, or organizational process assets. For example, milestone dates, contractual obligations, and constraints. Okay, so these are places where we're going to find our requirements, right? Product requirements, those refer to the actual product or result and often identify the features to be delivered, as well as some additional specifications, including performance requirements, of the product. I mean, if we don't meet the or conform to the requirements, for that product. For example, the grade of steel, that needs to be used in the output, or wood, or any material that would go into it, then we will have, missed the boat on delivering the value that the customer was wanting, right? Often these are decided by the organization. They include functional and non-functional aspects of the product. Non-functional requirements are other requirements related to the performance of the product, often dictated by the organization. For example, availability, how and when service is available, capacity, the level of service performance, speed, throughput needed, continuity, disaster recovery speeds, right, for example, and security, any of the protections that are needed. Those are considered non-functional requirements. Quality requirements are usually tied to the product quality aspects and usually include compliance matters as well. Business requirements usually are identified in the business case or project charter and are aligned with business objectives, for example, sales goals. Stakeholder requirements, they usually are reporting requirements necessary, especially for external stakeholders. Maybe you have a project that is heavily regulated, or has some regulatory implications. Transition or readiness requirements are those to ensure the result can be used effectively by the customer, right? Releasing functionality through controlled introductions and then general availability, for example. So these are the main types of requirements. Others can include systems and other legal or contractual requirements. So we mentioned the collect requirements process earlier as a part of a predictive scope planning process. Now let's look a little bit closer at what's involved in that. So the project manager will leverage expert judgment, which is a leadership power skill, and it's essential for many tasks, including determining requirements for scope. Other interpersonal skills are also used, such as the nominal group technique, observation, and facilitation. We're not going to touch base on some of that stuff right there. You're going to get, if you haven't already been exposed to it yet, you're going to be exposed to some of these as well. The project manager conducts data gathering primarily through communication, which we just discussed. We'll look at benchmarking more closely on the next slide, followed by a closer look at some analysis techniques. The project manager and project team will employ data representation methods to visualize the ideas, concepts, and progress. Visual tools like context diagrams and prototyping are also useful to better understand the scope requirements. So we're going to begin looking a little more closely at a few of these in the next slides, but all of them are listed in the course glossary. We need to use effective communication techniques to gather or elicit the data that will form the requirements. These techniques often include interviews, questionnaires and surveys, observations, focus groups, and facilitated workshops. This table here outlines the characteristics, advantages, and some considerations or potential drawbacks to each communication technique. In preparation for the exam, you should study this table to understand the advantages and considerations of each technique. And I'll tell you why this is really important, because I do remember, I don't remember much about the exam, except that it was long and it was hard. But I do remember getting questions, where it talks about, requirements, gives you a scenario around collecting requirements, and it asks you to identify, the best way to elicit the requirements for that particular project. So if you're not familiar with the characteristics, the advantages and the considerations or drawbacks, you may miss an opportunity to get the most points possible on that particular question. So I do encourage you to study this table here, be very familiar, with how you can go about, the different techniques you can use to collect requirements. Okay. As we mentioned back on slide 21 on the collect requirements process, the project manager can use benchmarking as a data gathering tool to compare and measure performance, as well as generate ideas and product requirements. Benchmarks can be made against other projects or products within the organization or compared to available published standards. Project managers often use benchmarks to monitor various business units and compare metrics. For example, sales per employee with other companies. In my own organization, since I'm in the customer experience, we talk a lot about Net Promoter Score. We are often looking at, how are we doing compared to how our, mass markets is doing. So, we all kind of look at different statistics and compare, right? Marketers will benchmark the efficiency of different campaigns and strategies, such as email marketing benchmarks. And in accounting, the project manager can compare profitability, solvency, or gross margin to industry averages. By analyzing benchmarks, project managers can identify areas for improvement and identify requirements to optimize the overall performance. Can you remember the other methods for data gathering? Can't go to slide 21. Yeah. Some of those were brainstorming, interviews, focus groups, and questionnaires and surveys, of course. So those are some of the other ways that we can go about gathering data. Okay. Why might we think benchmarking is effective in gathering data for scope planning, and why would you probably choose it instead of other methods? Anybody got any ideas?
Surveys give you quick turnaround, like quick data typically. Observations give you what's going on right now.
Yeah, exactly. Benchmarking it's got a historical component too, right? To it, and of course it's there. I mean, some of those measurements are already there. You may as well use them, right, as comparison. So yeah, that's perfect. Perfect. All right. Yeah, depending on the project you're using, yeah, benchmarking would be very useful. All right.
There was a definition on that previous one. I didn't know if you wanted to show that.
Sure, let me go back to it. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. If I read it out normally, I'll normally not show it on the screen, but I should have, right? Yeah. So benchmarking, the comparison of actual or planned products, processes, and practices to those of comparable organizations so that you can identify best practices, generate ideas for improvement, and provide a basis for measuring performance. And again, I kind of use that example with us with Net Promoter Score, right? We like to look at how are we doing, on our side compared, on the business side compared to the mass market side. We often look at the different measurements, and compare ourselves to how mass markets is doing as well. So if they're doing something better, getting better results, right, we want to investigate that and leverage maybe some of the stuff that they've done, right? We don't need to recreate the wheel. All right. So we have a lot of requirements now. We've been gathering. How do we know what to start working on first, right? I mean, gazillion requirements. The project team can leverage the techniques listed in this first column of this table during planning meetings to determine what work should be done and how it will be prioritized. So we'll talk about some of these techniques here. So Moscow analysis. Di Clegg, who's a seasoned professional in the field of database technology, is credited with the development of the Moscow analysis for use in prioritizing requirements. This technique helps stakeholders to identify the importance of each requirement by identifying requirements by whether they are a must-have, a should-have, a could-have, or a won't-have, perhaps for now. A key benefit of this technique is that it facilitates the comparison of several points of view, right? So we get to hear from different people as to what they think, okay? The Kano model is a project management technique developed by Noriaki Kano, and it prioritizes requirements based on the degree of customer satisfaction. These requirements would be classified as to whether they would produce delighters and exciters, satisfiers, dissatisfiers, or indifference or passives. And so the happier the customer is because of the requirement, the higher the priority of the requirement. A key benefit of this prioritization approach is that it focuses on delivering customer satisfaction and loyalty. The paired comparison analysis was developed by an American pioneer in the fields of psychometrics and psychophysics, L.L. Thurston. And it facilitates prioritization by rating and ranking alternatives by comparing one requirement against another requirement. So this technique is good for small range or subjective requirements. And then lastly, the 100 points method, also known as the fixed sum or fixed allocation method, was developed by Dean Leffingwell and Don Widrick. Both these gentlemen have made significant contributions to the field of software requirements. And in this technique, the team will vote for the importance of requirements on a list, taking 100 points to distribute. This technique is useful in any size group of stakeholders, and it's kind of known for soliciting a depth of thought. Okay, so where I could see, here and again from an exam perspective, is you're given a scenario, right, and you're asked, hey, you got to prioritize the requirements and everything. What's the best method for prioritizing these requirements based off the information you've been given? Okay. All right. So that gets us to about halfway through. And look at there, it's right at 6 o'clock Central Time right now. Man, that was fantastic. So why don't we do this? Let's take about a 10-minute break. I'll give you time to hop up, stretch your legs, get a sip of water, and then we'll meet right back here about 10 minutes after the hour. Okay? All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you in 10 minutes. All righty, it's 10 after the hour. We'll go ahead and get started with the second portion, continuing our conversation on scope tonight. Now we're going to talk about representing our data, right? We got a lot of data we've been gathering and so forth, but to have a lot of details and not be able to communicate it effectively, right? That is not going to help us out too much. So we need to talk a little bit more about how we can represent data. So visual data and information are simply artifacts that organize and present our data and the information in a visual format, such as charts, matrices, and diagrams. Visualizing data makes it easier for people to absorb it, thus making it informative to making decisions. Visualization artifacts are often produced after the data has been collected and analyzed. In addition to helping to visualize ideas, concepts, and progress, some are also used for gathering requirements, while many other techniques are used later to show progress or evaluate quality aspects of the project. There are many techniques that the project manager can leverage to represent data. Mind mapping, for example, can facilitate the consolidation of ideas created through individual brainstorming sessions into a single map to reflect commonality and differences in understanding and to generate new ideas. Affinity diagrams can be used to show large numbers of ideas classified or grouped for review and analysis. For example, imagine your team discusses common complaints about meetings. After the brainstorming session, the project manager or facilitator groups these grievances based on shared themes such as lack of agenda, time management, and a lack of participation, just to name a few. On a funny note, I came across a chart. I was looking around yesterday, and I thought this was the funniest chart here, or visualization, right? World's most accurate pie chart. Pie I have eaten, and pie I have not yet eaten. So that's a nice little visualization there. Another data representation tool is the context diagram. A context diagram is a visual depiction of product scope showing a business system, in other words, process, equipment, computer system, etc., and how people and other systems interact with it. The main purpose of a context diagram is to visualize the boundaries and interfaces of the project or product with the business system. In this diagram, we can see what is in scope and what is out of scope for the project. The center box, or the circle, represents the boundaries of the scope with external business units, organizations, or other groups that will provide information to the project, as well as receive information from the system. When used in a hybrid approach, the center may also include the high-level features or functions that would be in scope. Note that the definition of a context diagram specifies product scope. However, context diagrams can explore products as well as projects. As we wrap up this discussion on requirements collection, the project team can also leverage prototypes. Prototypes can be used for evaluation and experimentation by project stakeholders and other team members. Prototyping is a method of obtaining early feedback on user requirements by building a working model of the expected product. Prototypes can be used to solicit aesthetics, functionalities, etc. A prototype is essentially a working model of the expected product before we actually start to build it. In adaptive and hybrid projects, prototypes may be part of a release that earns value for the organization and not strictly just developmental in nature. Some teams find prototypes useful for learning about project requirements. The results of the evaluation can then be analyzed and assembled into a prioritized list of redesign ideas for the prototype or a detailed list of project requirements. This process can be cyclical with many revisions or iterations until the final requirements are determined. Additionally, storyboards are useful visuals to illustrate how a product, service, or result will function and move from one state to another. This is a common tool used in the advertising and entertainment industries to depict various scenes. Now let's shift our focus over to how the scope management plan helps project managers to build the detailed project scope. The scope management plan is a component of the overall project or program management plan. Like we mentioned earlier, you've got the requirements management plan. We also now have a scope management plan that's a component of our overall project or program management plan. And it describes how the scope how it will be defined. It provides a description of the scope activities for the project and how that work will be done. It also describes how the scope will be developed. It should describe the processes to prepare the project scope statement, and it serves to enable the creation of the work breakdown structure from the detailed project scope statement. The scope management plan describes how the scope will be monitored and controlled. It establishes how the scope baseline will be approved and maintained. And it describes how the scope will be validated. It specifies how formal acceptance of the completed project deliverables will be obtained. Moreover, the scope management plan can be formal or informal, broadly framed, or highly detailed. Lastly, information previously captured in either the business case or the charter regarding the scope of the project can be copied and included in the scope management plan. This includes the consideration of assumptions and constraints and other influences. For example, your enterprise environmental factors, your organizational process assets, and so forth, that will impact the way the scope is actually developed. The detail included will reflect the approach used to collect and document the scope of the project and that of the project. Okay. In fact, I was on a meeting the other day and came up and saw a really good example of what a scope management plan looks like. I'll pull it up just so you can see it. And it's just an example. There's plenty of them out there. You can Google and do it Google, and you'll get a plethora of them. Let me pull it over here. So this is an example of your scope, of what a scope management plan might look like, right? Some of the details, justifying it, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what are the business objectives, what are the deliverables, what's excluded, what are some of the constraints that we have, right? Are there any assumptions, and then, getting into some of the cost estimates as well. But this is just a simple view of what a project scope might look like. After you've collected, I've got to go to the next page. Sorry. After you've collected and documented requirements, now it's time to prepare the project scope statement. This is the textual document that includes all the requirements as specified for the scope of the project. It's an output of the plan scope process. Many scope statements include a scope description, both project and product, the acceptance criteria, any required deliverables, any out-of-scope items needed for clarification, constraints and assumptions, whatever is currently known. And once this has been approved and baseline, of course, changes to it will be made according to the change management plan. After gathering data, we need to now analyze it, right? As mentioned previously, analysis can help to identify your requirements. Let's take a moment to identify how these tools and techniques listed here are typically used for requirements analysis in predictive projects. As a side note, all of the definitions are in your course glossary as well. Okay. So document analysis, which on the right here does document analysis map to? I know there are keys in the answers. Does everybody understand what's being asked?
The third one.
Correct. Bingo. Yes, document analysis. We will derive new project requirements from the existing documents. Okay. Alternatives analysis. When is it used?
First one.
That's correct. Bingo. Very good. Okay. Product analysis.
The fourth.
That's correct. Yes, absolutely. Product analysis asks questions about a product, right? And we form from answers to describe use characteristics and other relevant aspects. And then, of course, that leaves us using expert judgment as a tool and technique to analyze the information needed to develop the project scope statement or any technical details. So your experience as a project manager, right, and working with various projects is going to help you to do this. Okay, very good. So this slide describes the various product analysis methods for projects that involve the development of a product. Depending on the product the project is delivering, you can use one or more of these methods to create a working understanding of it and develop the scope. These methods include product breakdown, systems analysis, requirements analysis, systems engineering, and value analysis. Okay. As mentioned previously, the scope management plan enables the creation of a work breakdown structure, or WBS, from the detailed project scope statement. A WBS is a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of the work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. It's also a graphical way in which we define the total scope of the work required to complete the project. The deliverables and their component sub-deliverables are represented on the WBS in levels of descending order from the project name at the top. The control account is a management control point where scope, budget, and schedule are integrated and compared to the EV, or earned value, for performance measurement. And you'll learn more about EV later on. In fact, I think I covered that with you guys towards the end of the whole set of courses you're taking. It has two or more work packages, though each work package is associated with a single control account. So, by using a work breakdown structure, we're also going to be able to, manage our costs, right, and measure our earned value of the work that we're doing by using this type of approach of numbering these packages. The planning package level contains known work content, but without the detailed scheduled activities. It represents the combination of the individual work packages that are assigned to the same control account. This can reflect groups of work that are paid from different accounts or work covered under different agreements or contracts. These accounts associated with different work packages within the WBS can be tracked and verified, again, against the earned value, like I said, or EV of a project to check performance. How well are we performing? Control points are often used by finance to track and verify that costs are within the budget. Okay. The lowest level represented is called a work package. This is the key level of the work breakdown structure where the project manager includes the schedule, cost, resources, risk, etc. Information being combined into the work package, which is the smallest chunk from the WBS and which includes the to-do activities so you can ascribe duration and estimated cost. I promise you all this is going to come forward. You're going to hear all this again. It is the key component that project managers must concentrate on when planning and managing the work. So that's kind of important. The work package is the key component that the project manager must concentrate on when planning and managing their work. Okay. The code of accounts is the numbering system, like you see here. The code of accounts is the number system that uniquely identifies each component of the work breakdown structure, like an outline form, and often refers to sections in the scope statement. Okay, it's a way of organizing our work. Predictive planning approaches start with the high-level project deliverables up front, and then they decompose them into more detail. The level of decomposition is based on specific project needs and the level of granularity needed to manage the project effectively. The steps involved in decomposition include 1, identifying the variables and the work tasks that are, identifying the deliverables and the work tasks that are necessary to accomplish the deliverable, structuring and organizing the WBS, decomposing high-level WBS scope components into low-level components, developing and assigning that unique identification code to each component from the code of accounts, and then reviewing the decomposition of work packages and verifying that they align with the project requirements. I know probably to many of you this, sounds like, well, I'll probably never do this, or maybe some of you do it, in your work. I can tell you in my roles over the years, I haven't really had to do this type of granularity, but and very big, you have to keep in mind, PMI is looking, this whole set of practices that you're learning about are in consideration of enterprise size type projects. So think of building a plane, right, or building a high rise or a hospital or something like that. So all these concepts have to take those types of projects, that size of project into consideration, and it will get you, if you work on projects of that nature, that expanse, right, you're gonna get involved in managing a work breakdown structure like this that will have these code of accounts assigned to them. Oops, I went backwards. The technical specifications for a product may be documented in a separate specifications document, or they may be documented as an extension to the WBS. This extension, known as a WBS dictionary, elaborates the information for each deliverable or work package in the WBS. Think of the information that would be needed to convey the results of planning this portion of the project to an individual or team to deliver that result. That is what appears in the dictionary. It can refer to multiple levels of the WBS, but it is critical to the work package level. Acceptance criteria are set early in predictive life cycles, and they're also specified here in the WBS dictionary and in the project management plan. Okay. So a baseline is the approved version of a work product or plan. Actual performance is compared to baselines to identify the variances. The scope baseline is the first of the 3 baselines to be identified. Because changes may be required to meet either schedule or budget constraints, the final baselining of the scope is done simultaneously with the other 2 baselines, the schedule baseline and the cost baseline. The scope baseline, along with the schedule and the cost baselines, become part of the overall project management plan. Even though we do a preliminary scope baseline until the schedule and the cost baselines are completed and integrated, changes may be needed to the scope to meet those other constraints. Once all these baselines have been completed, they are simultaneously baselined and then can only be amended using the change control process. So, kind of to re-paraphrase all that, right, is that, your scope baseline can be preliminarily set, but once you start talking about schedule and costs, you might find that there's some things in your scope that may need to change, okay? So that's why your preliminary scope baseline can be preliminary, but when it all comes down and said to it, all three of them are going to be solidified and agreed to at the same time. Okay? And then any changes that have to happen have to go through the change management process. Okay? The end of the project or handoff to the customer is part of your scope of work, and it needs to be planned for. Activities to fulfill transition and implementation plans are included in the scope of work. How the result is made available to the customer or end user is often the result of the approach used. This plan will help to determine the transition requirements needed to deliver the result. Closing projects and phases and transition handovers are going to be discussed at the end of this whole set of courses that you're taking or topics that we're covering with you, and they'll be discussed in Lesson 6, okay, Lesson 6. We've looked at scope planning in predictive environments. Now let's turn to scope planning in adaptive environments, okay, or adaptive environments. Project teams that use adaptive life cycles take a different approach to planning project work. They leverage incremental or iterative development and user stories in most adaptive life cycles. Although user stories are similar in concept to requirements, as we mentioned earlier, they propose an alternative way of looking at the requirements process. As you recall from slide 15, a user story is an informal, general explanation of a product, service, or software feature written from the perspective of the end user. Its purpose is to articulate how the feature will provide value to the customer. We'll get into more of the details about user stories in the slides ahead. Let's turn our focus now for a moment to the release and iteration planning processes, which are central to scope planning in adaptive approaches. This iteration planning meeting is collaborative, involving the product owner, the team, and the project manager. Process roles, such as the Scrum Master, may also be included in release and iteration planning to break that scope into larger releases and then the iterations or sprints. In release planning, or agile release planning, the team decides on the number of iterations to complete a release, the features contained in the release, and the goal dates for each release. In iteration or sprint planning, the team reviews the highest prioritized user stories or key outcomes. They ask questions, and then they agree on effort to complete that user story, and they determine the activities required to deliver the iteration objectives. Okay. The known work or scope is then organized on what is referred to as a backlog. A backlog, a layman's definition of backlog is that it's simply an accumulation of tasks that have not been completed or materials that remain unprocessed. I mean, every day we always have a backlog personally, right? In our work queue, we got but that's how we often end up with a to-do list, right? As we do our day-to-day jobs. So it's kind of similar concept here as well. A key concept to remember is that the backlog contains a prioritized list of work items. In terms of roles, the product owner maintains the backlog. In other words, they keep it updated in collaboration with the team or the teams. The project team or the local domain experts provide estimates of work, duration, and other information to the product owner. Okay. In addition to backlogs, product owners also have user stories, story maps, and road maps to help them to determine the scope of work. As you recall from slide 15, a user story is an informal, general explanation of a product, service, or software feature written from the perspective of the end user. Its purpose is to articulate how the feature will provide value to the customer. A story map organizes those user stories into functional groups within a narrative flow, in other words, the big picture of the product roadmap. The user stories, story maps, and roadmaps are normally written and maintained by the product owner and organized and prioritized in collaboration with the team. We'll discuss story maps in more detail later. Additional there we go. I had to fill out there. Additional terminology that project and product managers should be familiar with are epic and feature and how they relate to user stories. An epic is a large body of work that encapsulates significant deliverables or related features providing substantial business value. It represents, again, a substantial chunk of work that cannot be completed within a single iteration or sprint. Epics serve to organize tasks and create a hierarchy in the development process, and they can span across multiple sprints, teams, and even projects. So think of an epic as a high-level container that breaks down into smaller tasks called features. Epics can refer to different variations, especially for different personas, right? So when we think personas, that could be, the customer could be a persona, the seller could be a persona, the collections person can be a persona, okay? So epics can refer to different variations for these personas, requiring separate stories, right, to be written before beginning the development, because we want to make sure we have, the different perspectives, right? This may also be called a function that will be shown either on the product roadmap or included as part of the in-scope part of a context diagram. So, epics help manage complex work by breaking it down into manageable pieces while keeping the bigger picture in mind. Oops. So imagine you're developing a mobile app, and just kind of give you some context here. Imagine that you're developing a mobile app and you want to introduce a suite of features. That entire suite could be your epic, right? Each additional feature represents one or more user stories. So for instance, if you're building an app for an online beauty retailer, your epic might include features like augmented reality for virtual makeup try-ons, and chatbot functionality for customer queries, okay? Features are a set of related requirements that allow the user to satisfy a business objective need, in other words, to deliver business value. A feature represents the activities and efforts, including work such as documentation, bug fixes, testing, quality defect repairs to correct current functionality, in order to deliver capability that can be estimated, tracked, and managed as a set, as a unit. Note that the varied shapes here in the features in this graphic represent that each is unique in size and scope. And in the case of defect repairs, they can even span one or more epics. As previously noted, the user stories are the specific tasks that the teams work on to achieve the goals defined by the epic. User stories are then grouped and placed within the feature development. Okay. In both adaptive and hybrid projects, the product owner and or the customer are refining the backlog prior to iteration planning. So while the team is working on the current iteration, you have the product owner and or the customer thinking about the next iteration. The team and the product owner can also do additional refinement during sprint iteration This activity ensures that work that delivers the most value is being prioritized accordingly. If changes need to be made to the requirements, a user story will then be inserted and prioritized during this time. All right, so as we near the end here, we have a little bit of a quiz, and I hope I can navigate it properly here. So let's take this quick quiz here, okay? Which team member, or let's see, which of the two stakeholders perform project scope planning? You get to pick two.
B and C.
C.
I hear C, I heard A and
B.
D, B.
Helen.
All right,
Yeah, I will go with B.
all right. So there are two. So the two stakeholders that perform scope planning are your project manager and your project team, right? Helen Gray, she's in charge of product scope planning. In the adaptive part of the project team members are local domain experts in planning the scope of the work for each iteration. Your project manager and your project team. So Ang Finn, who's the project manager, wants to give the executive team an overview of the work ahead at the next strategy meeting. Which artifacts should he show them?
The roadmap.
Is everybody in agreement?
Yes.
All right.
Roadmap.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. That product roadmap is going to give them that high-level view. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, our objective in tonight's session was to provide an overview of scope planning in both predictive and adaptive projects. Including in the overview, we specifically covered from the exam content outline how scope is related to executing a project with the urgency required to deliver business value, and how the team is leveraged to subdivide project tasks as necessary to find that minimal viable product, right, the MVP. We also discussed the process of planning and managing scope, looking at both predictive and adaptive approaches, determining and prioritizing the requirements, and breaking down scope using the WBS and the backlog. And then lastly, we discussed planning and managing a project or phase closure or transition by determining the criteria to successfully close the project or phase. We didn't get into a lot of detail on that last one, but we did make the notation that that should be part of your scope planning process. Okay. So that concludes this content for the evening, and that gives us a little bit of time left over here. I'll open it up for questions if there are any. So let me just stop there and see if there are any questions, comments, and it can be about this or something else. You know, about the process y'all are going through right now, learning the content. Well, good. I'm glad y'all have absorbed it. I know it was a lot of information. In closing, you know, I want to say thank you for your time tonight and your attention. I know it's hard at the end of the day to listen to some of this stuff, right? But I really do appreciate your time and attention to it. Please take the time to go back over it if you got a few minutes this evening, just to kind of, you know, cement some of the things that you've learned tonight. It's been great to be able to cover this topic with you. If you do have any additional questions later, you know, don't hesitate to reach out to me individually. I'll be happy to answer the question or to get an answer for you if I don't have one. As I mentioned earlier, I will be with you again toward the end of these sessions that you're taking, right? I'll be back with lesson 5. But until then, I want you to enjoy the content to come and go out and find that accountability partner. Y'all have a great evening, all right?
Thank you,
Thank you,
Cynthia.
Cynthia. You too.
Thank
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.